Good evening. If you're just joining us, welcome to the concluding symposium of this year's Transmediale Festival. This year we are closing the first day of our symposium, This is Anarchy. This is not anarchy, this is chaos, with the annual Marshall McLuhan Lecture given this year by Fanwell Antwi, an assistant professor in the Department of English at the University of British Columbia. Held in cooperation with the Embassy of Canada to Germany in Berlin, the Marshall McLuhan Lecture invites a figure in the Canadian cultural landscape whose work expands on McLuhan media theories in the context of contemporary culture and society. Fanwell's work focuses on questions of desire, the poetics of identity, and the intimacies of archives and everyday living. In this evening's lecture, he draws on the history of dub poetry and explores how the practice of dub poets is one of transformation and one that insists that dreaming is not a passive activity that happens at night, but rather is an active practice of organizing into being a different world. Joining him this evening is Max Haven, a writer and teacher and the current Canadian chair in the Radical Imagination at the Lakehead University, where he co-directs the Reimagining Value Action Lab. After Fanwell's lecture, Max will join him in conversation and also open up this conversation to questions from the audience via our Telegram group. So first of all, I'd like to say a very, very warm welcome to Fanwell and also a very warm welcome to Max as well. So thank you both for being here today.
Thank you. Good morning from Vancouver, where I am coming to you from, and via servers and other digital infrastructures on unceded and stolen indigenous territories of Turtle Island, including the traditional ancestral territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Coquitlam nations. I want to thank the organizers of this symposium for their swift ingenuity in making it possible for some of us who are unable to travel to be able to participate. Particularly, I want to thank the leadership of Artistic Director of Transmedia, Nora, whose commitment since taking on this job has been to reimagine the terms around which we have conversations around media art, a commitment that has opened up the kinds of dialogue we are able to have about technology, dialogues that dares to dream otherwise. For that, thank you, Nora, and thank you and your team and folks at the Canadian Embassy in Berlin for the invitation to deliver this year's Marshall McLuhan Lecture. In addition to Nora, I want to acknowledge some members of the organizing team with whom I've had the pleasure to work with on other projects on this year's theme for refusal. I want to thank Ben Evan James, Transmedial's film curator, who invited Rhea Storr and me to make work for the year's program. I also want to thank Paul, the producer for this event, and the team he works with, particularly Jade and Nora, the backstage crew who kept my nerves at bay, for all the tech support. To the rest of the organizing team, again, thank you for all of your work. I dedicate this talk to my close friends and family members. I have not known how to make the chance to speak to and be with some of you during this pandemic because my capacity to be present with others and given the ways that I used to before the pandemic has dwindled, but know you are all with me in my heart and prayers. My presentation today is called Anti-Colonial Dreaming, the Elemental Poetics in Dub. I'm here to play with some ideas and bring fields that are not typically thought together, Marshall McLuhan and dub poetry. The technological setting of the 1950s and 1960s, the periods of uncertainty and accelerated development that energized Marshall McLuhan's work, was also the anti-colonial setting that flourished social movements that would energize the poetic movement of dub poetry. Encoded in McLuhan's Understanding Media, The Extinctions of Men, his most influential text on the field of media studies is a dream of humanism that presents itself as a collective and expansive we. Let's look at the opening pages of Understanding, where he frames media. Slide 1, please. Rapidly, we approach the final phase of the extinction of man, the technological assimilation of consciousness, when the creative process of knowing will be collectively and cooperatively extended to the whole of human society, much as we have already extended our senses and nerves by the various media. Wendy Chung, in her new book, Discriminating Data, is as suspicious of this collective we as I am, even though elsewhere she points out how we turn McLuhan's contributions into what she calls aphorisms as ways of numbing ourselves to the impact of his thought. In her introduction to Discriminating Data, she states, quote, McLuhan's we excludes most of humanity, end quote. Continuing, she argues, and I quote, McLuhan's framing of media as the extensions of man equated slaves, staples, and media. Some humans were men and others their extensions. This extension was dangerous not because it dehumanized or deprived slaves of their liberty, but because it made would-be masters dependent on these resources, end quote. The on-brand, describing ways that the captors enter the captive's body in a map to the door of no return, helps us understand how Chang's language of resources underlines the manufactured violence encoded in the language of extensions. Next slide, please. Brand writes, slaves become extensions of slave owners. Their arms, legs, the parts of them they wished to harness are used with none of the usual care of their bodies. Their captive bodies represent parts of their own bodies that they wish to rationalize or make mechanical or inhuman so as to perform the task of exploitation of resources or acquisition of territory. These captive bodies then become the tools sent out to conquer the natural world. Brand's formulation of extinction in terms of racial colonial orders reformulates the human technological diet in McLuhan's work by setting the mechanical and technological tools of media in the scene of plantation. Let us listen to another McLuhan framing of media. Next slide, please. But despite our self-protective escape mechanisms, the total field awareness engendered by electronic media is enabling us, indeed compelling us, to grope towards a consciousness of the unconscious, toward a realization that technology is an extension of our own bodies. The slave was a technology that extended the slave owner's body, and this extension marks an emerging point of modern technology and media. The machine as slave, the slave as machine. Toronto-based dub poet Lillian Allen fights back against the disembodied we of McLuhan. The shared and unshared context of Toronto for Allen and McLuhan, and my own geographic imaginings of the city I grew up in, is a paper for another time. In the meantime, let's listen to her poem, Revolutionary Tea Party. Next slide, please. The we of Allen, as Maria Caridad Casas points out, is, quote, an inclusive invitation, a reaching out to the listener. It offers a vision of cooperation and stability as political relationship, end quote. The collective for McLuhan is the universal everyone who uses media, a move which quietly eliminates other techno-modernity in its wake. Allen's we is not a universal we. It is a social we at a tea party, a gathering. And if not COVID, I would say a face-to-face social gathering, one that invites you to bring your voice. The distinctiveness of your voice is not for the purpose of self-aggrandizing, but for the purposes of building a revolution together. Unlike the media revolution that McLuhan talks about, the revolution which Brand helps LC is linked to the industrial plantation revolution of slavery, the kind of revolution that the poets offer through technology of the voice is different. And by different, I mean to say the technologization. Let's try that again. And by different, I mean to say the technologizing human capacity that Brand points to maps a centrifugal force where power goes outward. The motion of the Revolutionary Tea Party reverses the direction of this force from centrifugal to centripetal. Hence, the secular direction and temporality of power rolls inward, goes to the people. My presentation today is not to think through Marshall McLuhan's work in relation to Black studies or anti-colonial struggles and theories. Rather, my effort in bringing the technological setting and anti-colonial climate together is a reminder to media studies scholars who work in the wake of McLuhan to bring histories of conquest, colonization, slavery, race to bear on their work if, as scholars, we are to acknowledge the ongoing influence of McLuhan's work on our mediated world. Rehistoricizing McLuhan's technological setting within the anti-colonial climate of the moment allows us to hear something else in his work. Let's take as an example his now famous aphorism, "The medium is the message," which we have come to know is his way of reminding us how the content of the medium is always another medium. Over the years of his writing, the aphorism went from "the medium is the message" to "the medium is the message" to "the medium is the mess age" to "the medium is the mass age." In remediating McLuhan, my colleague Richard Cavell notes that, quote, his books were consistently montaged, cut and pasted until he came to call them non-books, mashups of disparate traditions and high and low cultural references, end quote. What Cavell calls montage and mashups might also be understood as a rhythm method, a creative process known as versioning, a major component of Jamaican music and in dub poetry. I mean, let's be real for a second. McLuhan could not have avoided hearing Jamaican speech in his life in Toronto. Everyone in the University of Toronto neighborhood where he lived had Jamaican nannies. As a result of the West Indian domestic scheme, the immigration program from 1955 to 1967. He was within walking distance of Kensington Market. Who cleaned his office? I kind of want to speculate. In other words, who taught McLuhan how to dub? What does dub poetry, this Caribbean and especially Jamaican diasporic art form, have to teach us about the increasingly urgent issues resounding in our ecological and political moment? How does meditating on the ways in which the creative and political traditions of dub poetry express and renew themselves in the transnational movements of Black art in the post-war period? What would it mean to dream together intentionally of a better world as dub poets do in a moment when we appear to be living without alternatives to the colonial and racial violence directed towards Black life? Dub poetry offers what David Scott might call conceptual resources with which we can begin to extract a new horizon of possibilities from within the moral and epistemic contours of today's global neoliberal formations which are often characterized by the discouragement, degradation, and dismissal of the dreams of the oppressed. Since its acknowledgement by the global literary scene in the 1960s and 70s, dot poetry has made several radical political interventions. We can think of its emergence as part of several anti-colonial movements and amplifying post-independence movements of Caribbean nations and the crumbling of the British Empire. Increasingly, we might also attend to the community mobilizing focus of its practice. Celebrating the nation language demonized by the colonizer, the poets have shifted the balance of criticism in favor of seeing Creole language registers as linguistic innovation, as art form, as anything other than unacceptable English, the predominant judgment of the colonial education system. As an artistic movement, then, the poetry problematizes the terms on which our politics and the literary are negotiated. It troubles demarcations between high and popular culture and contributes to the literary, musical, visual, technological, and dance movements of a transnational Jamaica. The collective imaginative work that produces these horizons is the work of dreaming, I argue. Blackness, as we see in Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Mask, is an experience that is dreamt of by others who, armed by the structures of white supremacy and a world shaped by slavery and colonialism, imagine Black life as a certain array of significations and then makes that horrifying dream a reality. The practice of collapsing the line between dream and reality is already happening as catastrophe, as a nightmare. The dream of the plantation makes it so that every dream is always already a nightmare and every nightmare a dream. Dub poetry, as well as dub dreaming as world building, emerges out of and as a resistance to that dehumanizing dreaming pattern. I read dub poetry as offering us a technology for anti-colonial dreaming. And I do so by framing it as part of a tradition of Caribbean movements where dreaming as a source of form and creative impulse abounds, from reggae to the Rastafari movement to surrealism. Surrealism as a movement was a way that radicals sought to make sense of the absurdity of a technologically mediated society. Robin Kelly in Freedom Dreams, for example, points out how Black surrealism is a response to being made into a machine, this overabundance of imagination, this refusal to accept any form of instrumentalization. When we think about the Caribbean's relationship to surrealism, we often trace this movement to the French Caribbean. We mark the now famous account of the group of Martinique students at the Sorbonne forming the Caribbean Surrealist group Légitimes Défense in 1931 as a key moment. While the surrealism of this group was, as far as Césaire was concerned, a little too assimilationistic, he goes on to acknowledge in an interview with Charles Rowell that the group, next slide please, that the group brought us a plus of liberty, a greater audacity to ascertain ourselves beyond the conventional and rigid forms of literature. We all had the fervent desire to see this oppressed, confined, isolated people express itself in the strongest meaning of this word, with something that came from its gut and was hurled in the daylight. I connect surrealism to dub poetry partly to open up a line of research that considers the historical continuities and divergences between artistic movements across the Caribbean and its diaspora, one can add. I think there is work to do on the various Caribbean artists, philosophers, and thinkers whose work sits comfortably with the surrealist movement in the French Caribbean and also played a significant role in the anti-colonial movement in the whole region. That movement has become a hallmark of dub poetry, with long and distinguished names as Fanon, Suzanne Césaire, Aimé Césaire, and Edward Glosson, among others. What might it mean to listen for a long haul of fervent desires stretching from Césaire's moment to those of the dub poets? In addition, I see in dub poetry what Aaron Gamagisha sees in Caribbean thought. Quote, Its existence as a tradition of thought is both independent and enmeshed in so many global traditions of the last 2 centuries, end quote. If Surrealism's enmeshment with Caribbean thought exposes how Europe refreshed its artistic traditions via other worlds, it remains to be seen what the poetry's enmeshment with Surrealism might expose. In the interview with Roel, Césaire notes that, quote, in spite of our imperfect knowledge of English, we had read people like Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, Leda Sterling Brown, and other people of the Black Renaissance collected in Alan Locke's anthology, The New Negro. Thus, foregrounding the conversations between French Caribbean surrealism, the Harlem Renaissance, and through Mackay, internationalist communism, touchstones of the movement Césaire and Leopold Senghor theorized so powerfully as negritude. Let us not forget negritude's debt to the English language works like the Jamaican Mackay's 1929 novel, Banjo. In other words, we will do well to remember that movements call and respond to other movements. I recall this complex field of collaboration, continuities, and influences in order to foreground the connective tissue of dreamscapes that inform the social, political, artistic movements of not just surrealism and dub poetry, but reggae music and Rastafari as well. As a transnational popular music form that facilitates cultural dialogues between, to quote Louise Chotsoki, legacies of black on black transnational politics, end quote. Reggae music tuned the world's ears to the socio-cultural realities and socio-political dis-ease of the post-colonial moment and worked to capture the logics of dominance. In their lyrics and sonic architectures, reggae artists ranging from Bob Marley, Garnet Silk to the Wailers variously dreamt an anti-capitalist and anti-colonial world different from the oppression of injustice. In this way, reggae music refuses institutional and colonial authority. Keeping in mind that reggae music's commitment to where am I? Okay, I found myself. Keeping in mind that reggae music and dub poetry co-emerged in the 1960s and 70s, it is not surprising that reggae music's commitment to be heard and felt reverberates through dub poetry's remix practice of crossing genres. Theories of dreaming are fundamental to the aesthetic, ethical, philosophical, and spiritual practices associated with the Rastafari movement. Its political project of engineering, to quote Erna Brodber, a black space memorializes Zion, the place and meaning of Africa, Ethiopia in particular, as its model for anti-colonial black struggle, in order to mark a defiant retreat out of sufferation, as well as to insist on a conscious refusal of the inequalities designed to contain black social life in the place they call Babylon. The creation of this promised land signals a work of dreaming. In the hope we hear in the Back to Africa philosophy that the Rastafari movement adopts, in its emergence in Jamaica in the 1930s lies a dream. What would it mean to consider the anti-colonial dreaming central to the Rastafari project of focusing on Africa and revaluing blackness outside the regimes of European modernity as offering us practices of black space reasoning? Take as an example one of Rastafari's central philosophies, Ital, the commitment to using things in their natural or organic states, a commitment that celebrates the harmonious intimacy between humans and nature. This commitment has environmental, ethical, and health implications, one being a plant-based diet with an avoidance of drugs and alcohol. I emphasize ganja as a plant so that I can also plant how this crop's ecological, herbal, and medicinal systems of knowledge inform the Rastafari movement systems of knowledge. Notwithstanding the racialized condemnation of this sacred herb, the criminalization of black people who recreationally use it, I want to focus on the rituals of smoking ganja as part of a Rasta dreaming practice. For many Rastafarians now, smoking, the elements of fire and wind, ganja, an element of earth, can be part of an elemental practice of convening harmonious possibilities into the universe. Because of the altered states that visit smokers under the influence of ganja, one can at once harness and conjoin the power of each element, and as a result of the sensorial exchanges and transfers that happen within these elemental interactions, stimulate a psychedelic and therapeutic state of consciousness that for some leads to growth and healing. Regardless of how one chooses to rationalize this altered state of consciousness, it is worth noting that ganja, used as a vehicle to enter different realms, dubs, to quote Oku Onoaro, out the isms and schisms to dub consciousness into the people them head. And by this, I mean the smoke from the burning becomes a technological and spiritual medium that carries messages between dimensions, emancipating one, possibly emancipating one from one's current place in the Babylonian world. When I describe dub poetry as offering a method of inquiry and a poetics for anti-colonial dreaming, and to do so in relation to surrealism and to reggae and Rastafarianism via Marley, I am thinking of dreaming as a practice undergirded by the political tension between reality and dreaming, as well as the ecological and revolutionary world-making these anti-colonial movements inspire. This dreaming requires, for example, that we heed Carolyn Cooper's critique of how consumer and popular culture cleanses Marley's image to frame him, quote, as the epitome of pacifist reggae consciousness, end quote. It requires us to remember songs like Babylon System. Slide, please.
Much too long, rebel, Babylon system is the vampire, yeah, sucking the children day by day, yeah, me say the Babylon system is the vampire, falling empire, sucking the blood of the sufferers, yeah, building church and university, oh yeah, deceiving the people continually. Yeah, me said them graduating thieves and murderers. Look out now, they're sucking the blood of the sufferers.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The anti-colonial dream practice I am talking about here, others, to quote Carolyn Cooper quoting Mark Finman, incendiary incantation, and is critical of institutional violence. The revolutionary surrealistic tone of the poetry can be read, in Anthony Burgess' terms, as a prophetic redemptive tradition within the Black radical political tradition. In saying that the poetry rides on movements that are critical of a dream world of complacency, movements that rejected the status quo politics of their time, I am saying that the poetry drives dreams. Like the surrealist of Andre Burton's famous first manifesto, the poets, quote, believe in the future resolution of these two states, dream and reality, which are seemingly so contradictory, into a kind of absolute reality, a surreality. In other words, the poetry is fused with images of reality and dream. Through attending to Dobbs' conversations with other artistic movements, it becomes possible not just to situate Dub poetry as part of the Black radical tradition, but to situate this Black radical tradition in turn as a tradition of anti-colonial dreaming. Within this tradition, the poetry dreams into practice creative portals of the elaboration of an alternative world view, and the poets, as social dreamers, engage with the dream of the not yet and offer different life worlds within which Black life happens. From slave narratives that I read in the 19th century, I've come to regard dreaming as an anti-colonial technology because in times of slavery, it was among the few, if not the only space of freedom. The slave driver cannot, for all they would like to do so, enter the minds of the colonized. The colonial administrator was always fearful of the dreams of the subalterns he could not see, hear, or imagine. The dream, then, can be a space beyond the colonial matrix. Thus, the Dub form, informed by the dreaming dimensions of a Dub philosophy and poetics, instills radical hope and opens up space for us to imagine courageously instead of drifting through the motions of creaturely existing. The poets and their work encourage us to approach dreaming as an active, cooperative, rigorous, and generative process with creative output. As a process-based art that continuously moves forward as well as backward, the poets and their work root Black creativity in dialogic practices that show how dreaming together, to cite Sharon Slowinski's work on dream, can serve to reanimate a world that has been flattened by dark times, end quote. For Slowinski, quote, dreams have a way of compelling us to speak. And it is this later gesture, the drive to disclose the experience to someone, that transforms dream life into a political matter proper. I'm here thinking about Allen's Revolutionary Tea Party. How better to illustrate Dobbs' world-making capacities for dream work than by turning to Dreamer, a poet by the late Dub dreamer Jinbin Tabriz, who passed away last year in August, and she's dearly missed. Please go check out her work. She was based both in England and in Jamaica, went back and forth, and she was one of the earlier Dub poets who intervened in a tradition that was primarily men. Her, Lillian Allen, who I said earlier, were two of those earlier. In Dreamer, please, next slide. In Dreamer, Breeze introduces readers and listeners to a woman. Let's hear it.
Round a rocky corner by the sea, seat upon a driftwood, you can find she, gazing across the waters, a stick in her hand, trying to trace a future in the sand.
Can you please play it again? The beginning was a bit soft.
Round a rocky corner by the sea, seat upon a driftwood, you can find she, gazing across the waters, a stick in her hand, trying to trace a future in the sand.
Thank you very much. In 2018, this poem was used by Poems on the Underground, a project by the London Underground Rapid Transit Network to commemorate Windrush Day in England. The woman in Breeze's poem invites us and the wider audience riding the London Underground, those to whom this project brings poetry, to consider the kinds of dreams that send so many people from the Caribbean to board the Empire Windrush and other vessels like it. The hundreds of thousands of Caribbean people, the Windrush generation, who responded to the call of the British Empire's labor crisis, of whom many were recently denied citizenship and deported in order to fulfill the conservatives' racist dream of a white Britain, were also dreamers, gazing across the water to the optimism of a place where they were invited to believe the sun doesn't set. Breeze teaches us that a dream is as much a vehicle as it is a transport for the expression of difficult desires, ideas, and conflicts. The title tells us that this woman dares to dream, is a dreamer, and desires a future in the sun. The sun is not, for example, referring to the tourism that we have come to associate with the Caribbean, nor is this imaginative dream work of gazing across the water akin to the escapism of romanticism, in which we see writers and poets secluding themselves from the problems of the world so as to enter the otherworldly realms of the imagination. In fact, the methods of dreaming that Breeze and other dub poets offer is less about a romantic aesthetics of liberation, exemplified by what Lee calls the dissonance imagination of the Romantics. For dub poets, rather, dreaming involves a mutual aid and requires us crossing not just imaginative distances, but physical ones, so as to be involved in artistic movements of their times and in community struggles on the local and global fronts. I am saying that in addition to the tradition of dreams of the French Caribbean Surrealist movement, this art form also extends our understanding of dreamwork traditions in the Anglophone world, including Romanticism. And as an aside, the McLuhan's Understanding Media work actually borrows its title from it's just escaping from a title of a collection of poetry called Understanding Poetry, and we see in his work his commitment to the romantic, as Oliver in his writing. The invocation of the sea invites us to imagine its location, its routes and resources, driftwood and stick, its turbulent histories, who and what it carries, takes, gives. We are able to comprehend how the tangible features of the seascape also invoke a more abstract dreamscape. What I mean is that by the sea alludes to island life, where the sea surrounds, and the insular horizon of life there invites dreams of elsewhere, of the unknown and yet to be known. The preposition by in by the sea marks the shoreline, where, much like the sacred place of the sea, encounters of all sorts take place. Three agents of change, the sea, the water, and the sun, rub up together in Breeze's Dreamer. These agents, with their elemental forces, transform a tree into driftwood. Breeze recodes this undervalued treasure of the sea into a valuable seed that holds the dreamer up in place as she dreams. Our work in her recoding is the technopoetics of dub, to borrow language from Chatsuki's The Sound of Culture. In this driftwood, Breeze urges us to note the echo of its other life form. For example, what tree might this driftwood represent? And how might doing the work to learn about this tree be a form of activism against the ways that global economy is reshaping, endangering the ecological world habitats of the Caribbean? If technology simply means the use of knowledge for creative and useful ends, then we can think of the sun, like the smoke of the ganja, as a technology that dries both the driftwood that the dreamer sits upon and the stick that she holds in her hand as some sort of charm or device to wave the future into being. This image of the dreamer with a stick in her hand trying to trace a future spells out the otherworldly space of dreaming at the same time that it foregrounds the necessary labor in dreaming. Given the elemental forces at work in this poem, the lines trying to trace a future invites us to read trying not only in terms of labor, effort, as I just noted, but also in terms of law, risk, critique, judgment. With this in mind, the word find in "pon a driftwood you can find she" is not simply a homophony of find, directing us to the location of the dreamer. The dreamer, for one thing, is not lost, since from the opening of the poem, we know she is round a rocky corner by the sea. These words describe more than the specific geographical place of the driftwood. While this description evokes the backdrop against which the dreamer sits, with images of rocky shores, wave exposure, or rock types floating in our mind's eyes, Breeze invites us to meditate on the delicate cost and labor of her dreaming. From this vantage point, to what kind of dream trace might Breeze be asking her audience, both in 91 when the poem was released on her album Tracks, and now as you are reading it, hearing it, to attend? One way I try to return to that trace is to focus on the driftwood. While I know that driftwood can be used to mend boats, I turn to the sun for its heat and focus on a different kind of repair. This stick, this possible driftwood washed ashore, waving back into the future, becomes firewood that the sun's heat will burn, and the smoke signal from it will foreshadow the fire of the dreamer as a new order of creation that the dreamer dreams. Repair, we see here, is not the domain of anti-colonial dreaming. After all, we see that the dreamer is neither disjointed nor estranged from the elemental forces in the poem. So, while we do not know the time of day that the dreamer while we do not know the time of day that the dreamer traces a future in the sun, nor whether the future she traces in the sun is in the air or in the sand, we do know the sun has a cycle that can help us forecast future seasonal activities. Through drawing our attention to the atmospheric interactions between the air, the sea, the sand, and the sun, Breeze highlights the ensemble of elements the dreamer might be using to forecast the future. In highlighting the ecological and geologic aspects of Breeze's dreamer, I'm foregrounding the technological tools that the poets take up in their poems to reanimate a world that has been flattened by dark times in their efforts to transform dream life into a political matter proper. And I'm about to end 2 minutes. Anti-colonial dreaming then problematizes the very definition of dreaming, I am suggesting. Breeze's dreamer emphasizes ways that dreaming is not just a night activity. We also dream when we are wide awake, nor is dreaming an individual activity. It is one that is done collectively and at the cost of consciousness and unconsciousness. The dreaming includes the process of collective visioning. In fact, it shakes up these boundaries as well as the discursive limits that have been set up around dreaming by blurring and unpacking the boundaries between dream and reality. Its possibilities as a method for dreaming is not just about offering us a different dream of a different world of liberation. It teaches us to dream differently by changing the very meaning of the verb, and in so doing gives us a searchlight, activating our senses to direct our attention to what has always been there, reassuring us not only about questions of the poetry's futurity, but also of our collective tomorrow. Here is an art form that asks us to listen as closely as we can to the moments in which we live, because listeners, the underscore, develop the facilities to change. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Fanwell. As always, when I hear you speak, my notebook is full of notes, and I can hardly make sense of them anymore. I feel in some way it's inspired its own somewhat surreal, dreamlike journey in a certain sense. There's so many things I want to ask you and follow up on. And before I get into them, though, I do want to encourage our audience to use the Telegram group to pose their questions if you would like them relayed to Fanwell. I'm sure that his extremely evocative talk will no doubt have awakened many questions and comments for you. I'm so glad you've brought this counterweight to McLuhan's legacy to us today and for our deliberations here on refusal at Transmediale, because I feel in some ways McLuhan's ghost is always very much with us on at least two fronts. I mean, we're quite familiar with citing him or being asked to cite him as a critic, as a theorist, as someone who we should tip our hats to whenever we speak about the media. And there's, of course, a lot of merit to that. But to only focus on that would be to forget that McLuhan is also, of course, extremely influential to the pioneers of Silicon Valley. And I use the word pioneer in all of the violence that word implies. which is to say the shock troops of settler colonialism, and maybe that settler colonial dream of Silicon Valley has now finally come to fruition in the 21st century. But what I appreciate about where you began today is noting that McLuhan's we and McLuhan's universalism draws on this long legacy of sort of Enlightenment humanism. Earlier today, we heard the name Sylvia Wynter, another amazing intellectual figure from Jamaica, referenced, and her concept of man one, who develops into man two. We heard man three even proposed today. And so here I want to note, along with you, that McLuhan's Understanding Media was published in 1964 and was one of those books you would see in the back pocket of the emerging baby boom generation as this guidebook. And the temporal coincidence of that and Fanon's publication of The Wretched of the Earth in French in 61 and translation into English in 63 has me thinking about two itineraries of the media that I think your talk is pointing us towards. On the one hand, we have the itinerary that materialized in the dream or nightmare that we're living now, which is where McLuhan's work went on to influence, very, very explicitly went on to influence people like Steve Jobs and many of the other early pioneers of technology. What if those people had instead read Fanon? What if instead, and I think you're dubbing onto and you're dubbing with McLuhan asks this question: what if they had learned to dub rather than learn to code? And I reference here your own use of the word encoding earlier as well, that you suggested to us that dub poetry encodes a long legacy of anti-colonial rebellion. And so I wanted to begin by opening up this strange dream of an itinerary of our techno-modernity, or whatever we're calling it these days, that never got to exist, which is that, in this moment when the darker nations, the poorer nations, as Vijay Prashad puts it, were throwing off the yoke of colonialism and slavery in the post-war period. What if that dreaming that you're speaking of was to have given us the kind of technologies that today enable us to even have this conversation? In that dream, what would this conversation be looking like for you? What would this conference even be looking like? Can we imagine, just to begin our conversation, what it would have been like had even the technologies that are allowing us to be here together today had come through that other itinerary which you're pointing to?
That's a great. Thanks, as always, a pleasure to think with you, Max. From our graduate school days till other shenanigans till now. Thank you for always being a great interlocutor to of thought and struggle. I think that's a provocative question. There's an irony, I think, to the question that you're asking through the mediated medium of that this conversation is taking place, that I find really quite lovely. The contradictory ways that we have to live our lives sometimes. And I'm not necessarily suggesting that I think it'll be a bit, I don't know. There's a poem that Leon Allen has a poem called Marshall and McLuhan that you brought my attention to, actually. And I was trying to find it. I was looking for it yesterday, and then you drew my attention to it again, and I couldn't find it. But there's a line in there, listening to a recording of it, where she talks about the analog ghost of the analog. Was it the analog? Okay, why am I even bringing something I can't remember? I was simply, I think I'm thinking through your question because I don't want to set up this distinction between the technological and the analog world. I'm not interested in those kinds of distinction or separation, but rather I'm interested in what is possible through for example, if we return to the Revolutionary Tea Party, that face-to-face gathering, what is possible for me? What is lost, or is this sensorial collectivity where things emerge, things come up without necessarily being programmed, or in this case, one of the things that made me anxious of coming today or doing this talk is I don't know who the heck is listening to this, where it is going to. And I think for some that would be quite exciting, but for me that actually kind of worries me in terms of what that would be used for, in terms of and so I'm interested in the possibilities of collective gathering in person, in that, and I know there's a sense that for it's quite complicated. What is I'm not making sense. I know there's so many implications what I'm saying, because for many, gathering online is what makes that collectivity possible. So I don't want to dismiss that at all. But for others, I'm interested in that coming to be together. It's the coming together that allows for what is on the horizon to emerge. Not already. So oftentimes we don't know how we will work together, and the being in the same space together allows for things to happen. So, for example, when I started speculating about how speculating about McCullen possibly dubbing, he, given the fact that he was based in Toronto, lived in Toronto, in the neighborhood he lived in the time period that he lives in, with the immigration program that was happening within Canada, particularly Toronto, the migration means that he was constantly encountering these without necessarily being aware of that. So that's what I mean by when I say the collectivity in person. It's not at all to say that I prefer one over the other, but that dreaming where we will intentionally meet to dream without necessarily knowing what the matter of the dream will be is something that I'm interested in and wanting to, the intentional meeting, gathering. And sometimes the intentional meeting, the intentional imagining together, that happened unintentionally, but because we were all in the same place at the same time. That is something that I think reading Breeze's The Dreamer, for example, is helping me think through these elements. Being there allows these elements to kind of come together, and the alchemy of that is something that I'm interested in. I hope that makes sense of some sort.
Yes, yes, of course. And I just want to let you know that we've had a comment from the ether out there, someone who identifies as a German of Jamaican heritage, who just wanted to let you know that the talk was extremely heartwarming and inspirational and insightful. So it's just to let you know who is out there. I wanted to pick up on your comment by bringing us back to that wonderful contrast you gave us between, on the one hand, the centrifugal notion of the kind of spin of the Mediaverse, and then the centripetal spin in some way, the centrifugal being something that pushes outward, and that you associate with McLuhan's sort of perspective around this this kind of mythology of progress, of unidirectional progress. And then on the other hand, the centripetal tonality, which you draw from Lillian Allen's work earlier in your talk. I feel that has a lot to do with what you're speaking about now, that there are these centripetal and centrifugal uses of media. And I wanted to invite you to play out that metaphor. And then, I also wondered if you had if you would say that there's forms of centripetal and centrifugal dreaming in some way.
Okay. I have not, I'm just looking at my notes, and I have not, I will come back to Sylvia when there's the question of, there's two thinkers that were that in different iteration I would love to have had time to think with, particularly around this idea of the extinction of man. And Sylvia Wynter was really a part of that for me, thinking through it. But there's so much to unfold in ways that, and I think reading Sylvia Wynter in relation to McLuhan for me is something I'm hoping to do, or to see who has done that work to be in dialogue with, because I think that there is what she has to say about Men 1 and Men 2, and how you invoke Silicon Valley in terms of not just in terms of also the racial capital of that project. I think there's something that I want to maybe think further about. And then the other person being two, I guess three thinkers that were also at the back of my mind as I was thinking through this paper. Saidiya Hartman's Scenes of Subjection again, and how she thinks about the extinction of the plantation. And I'm also thinking about Catherine McKettrick's work in terms both on demonic grounds and what she offers us there, and in an essay that I return to over and over by her, which is Plantation Future. So these are folks that I want to bring in dialogue with in terms of McCullen when I return to that we again. But to return to your now question about the centrifugal, well, both when we think about it in terms of Newtonian physics, like both of them are dealing with motion and secular forms, but the ways that they move, the direction is different. And I think there's I was struggling trying to figure. I still haven't worked it out completely yet. I'm still working it through. What I find fascinating about the poetry and its practice is what elsewhere I call the accordion method, by which I mean it at once things on a very small scale and a large scale. So on the community level, it is completely thinking through the mutual aid, how to support where one is based. And it's at once also thinking largely about the global concerns. So it finds ways to bring struggles together, struggles that move out. So it moves out at once. So I'm thinking about it earlier on, in this earlier, I'm thinking about Efua Cooper's work and Lillian Allen's and Clifton Joseph's, how they all spoke against apartheid. From the location of Toronto and speaking against that, or even reggae, how reggae music was a huge anti-colonialist project in that sense. So, and at the very same time, it is interested in talking about what's happening down the street from them. And so that kind of movement of both, and in moving out, is bringing the concerns of the out back in. And so there's this kind of worldling that the poets teach us, that we are not able to think about place outside of the local place outside of the world within which that we live in. And that is where I think I'm trying to work that metaphor of centripetal and centrifugal. But the difference is that each time it moves out towards people who are also moving in, working through the locale that they are entering in that sense. And that's something I'm still trying to think through. So as opposed to the techno-modernity, which moves out to extend into and move almost as if to a different way of thinking about progress. That kind of extension is about progress. And the kind of moving in, or the temporality, is not about Western notions of development or progress in that sense. Hence the secular. I'm trying to think through that secular notion that I think these dog poets are getting us to think about time. Yeah. I don't know.
Between chaos and anarchy. And I'll just leave that there for a minute, but I think it might, your terminology of centrifugal and centripetal might give us actually a language to think about the difference between somehow the kind of chaos that's been instilled by the form of racial capitalism that's now digitally augmented, and the forms of anarchy that also might appear to the wielders of power as disorder, but are in fact have their own forms of, maybe what Fred Moten and Stefan Harnett would call sort of planning. There's a kind of planning that's indecipherable. And what I really love about your language as you're unfolding it for us here around centripetal and centrifugal is it gives us a way of thinking about I won't say dialectics. I will say tidalectics
No.
to echo a term
Tidalectics,
I know you've
absolutely.
used before, that you take from glissant,
Absolutely.
this kind of moving in and out, the way that a tide comes with the rhythms of the moon.
Yeah,
I want to
and
go
I
to.
mean,
Oh yeah, please, please.
no. It's just, I mean, I was thinking, Kamwe Brathwaite teaches us a lot about that motion. So in terms of the time, anyways, we don't have time, so I won't go on. But please go on.
There's a new question here, but I'll go with the first question I got here. So Soren asks, in what ways can dub poetry, with its aesthetics of echoes and filters, relate to current data colonialism? Is there a potential to filter and echo data as a form of resistance, if not as a form of refusal? In what ways is dreaming a strategy in relation to platforms and to data in our moment?
Can you give me the second question as well? Because I'm looking at time, and maybe we can
Yes,
bundle
yeah,
them. See if we
absolutely.
can bundle.
I'm reading here. For social transformation to happen, it needs dreaming. But what about thinking of the present and how it feels like a dystopian dream to so many people? How it exists? How do we exist and bear witness in this liminality between these dream worlds? And the staff here have told me that we can go a little bit longer, so don't feel rushed in answering.
Okay. All right. The first question almost answers itself in some sense. Like, I think uh, um, the thing about echo that it's that echo surrounds. Echo doesn't have the movements of echo. It's not. It's not. It's not it doesn't move forward or and back. It moves all around. It surrounds. That's the language I can use to think about it. It surrounds in that sense. And so I want to maybe take that idea of the echo to think about the second question. There's one of the things that I appreciate, one of the things I keep on learning and continue to return to the dog poets to learn again, is this idea of revolution being the revolving, the rotation. Uh, if we think about it, if we think about it etymologically, and so we are being encouraged to not think in terms of the moment is not in itself a totality. What do I mean by that? This idea of this moment being a dystopian, which I am not disagreeing such a reading, is not totalizing. That there's a way that my fear is this. One of the things I worry at times is the single totalizing view of the now, as if there's no other horizon or there's no other mode of understanding the now, only through a dystopian lens, which is not at all my way to discount the moment that we live in at once. And so how do we so I'm not someone who is good at answering questions, as you can tell, but rather I would think with the question. And so in addition to thinking about this dystopian dream, what does this moment open up for us? That's something I would be interested to maybe think with someone with through that. Because I find it really quite arrogant. Given the kind of work I'm thinking, the elemental thinking I'm trying to do here, it's really quite arrogant on my part to know that the world is coming to an end when there are other beings who will continue the world and dream of the world in ways that maybe the technological work that we've done to bring us to this place are not able to do it. So perhaps the elemental poetics that I'm interested in is a way to shift the thinking from a very human centric into thinking about why there's indigenous folks are Our, water protectors are working towards protecting the waters, not only because of drinking safe drinking water, but yes, that too, but that these are beings that we need to that have their cycles of life, that have ways of teaching us. So the dystopian dream of this moment is, but I am less. I'm also hopeful that there are other ways of dreaming that are happening in that happening that maybe are not in line with what we are dreaming, the dreaming that's happening right now. So that's one way that I would think about it. I think um, I'm being a bit. I'm not refusing these questions, but rather I think I'm finding ways to not be locked in the moment of the kinds of thinking that the moment puts us puts us to work to push continue to verify in that sense. Because the thinking about, for example, that driftwood and the sun coming together and speculating or taking the leap to think that the heat between those two, the combustion, something happens between them. And I think I'm beginning to want to think more like the elements, that even when there's chaos, something else happens. When the fires that happen, something happened. It led to different disaster, which I'm now hopeful might wake us up in thinking about Vancouver, might wake us up to live differently. And so there's those kinds of unanticipated changes that these moments, if we open ourselves to the changes that are unfolding, might lead us to somewhere else. And I guess call me optimistic or call me poetic or whatever you want to say. I'm constantly looking for those possibilities. Yeah.
I like the idea that perhaps we should replace the word optimistic with poetic. There's something in
Yes.
poetry that gives us a kind of rigorous optimism that, yeah, I think it's we often get this kind of insistence that we should be optimistic, but I think being poetic is perhaps much more illuminating. And
For me, it
I guess
is.
I wanted
It is.
I want to bring us to a bit of a close here by asking you what you think about the future of this we. I mean, you began by I think giving us a very powerful and important critique of the we that animated the imagination or the dreams of McLuhan, and a whole generation was animated by his dream of the global village, the medium is the message, all of the slogans that have been sort of distilled from his legacy, and you contrasted that with the we that Lillian Allen presents, which is spelled differently in the way that it's written, but also pronounced differently and intoned differently, and evokes maybe a different sort of spirit or a different sort of element. I think that here at this festival, we're in the middle of a pandemic. We're contending with multiple global crises, as our last questions indicated. What do you think the future is of the we? What do you is there a we that can act in this moment, or is it many we's? What can dub poetry teach us about the possibility of us acting together in a moment where it feels like we must act together as we've never acted before, and yet where we seem to hardly know ourselves, whoever we is?
So in that poem, Allen uses both the standardized we and the WI we, the what you could say the phonetic. So she uses both of them, and I think I've thought about, it's not necessarily a switch and more to maybe go back to Casa's idea of an inclusive invitation. This invitation. What was I looking for? There's a new book that came out that was on Lillian Allen, that was edited by Ronald Cummins, called "Make the World New." The poetry of Lillian Allen, and it's with Wilfrid Laurier Press. And I was thinking about, I was reading it, spending time with it as I was preparing this, thinking through. It's making the world new by returning us to poems. It's a selected work by Lillian Allen, and it's making it new. And I wanted to believe that I was entertaining the possibility that it's not making the world new simply by gathering these, but rather it's and also some of the new poems Lynn Allen returns to and reworks them. So we see the work of versioning our work within this anthology that I really quite enjoy. But I was flirting with the idea that this newness, this obsession or the obsession with newness, um, all right, let me return to your question and get out of here before I say some things that I shouldn't be saying. Since this is going to be recorded and I'm talking to you, Mark, so it feels like there's a familiarity, and I forgot for a moment that we were being recorded. uh, I would say I think you answered the question when you said that it's different kinds of we's. The we's that have to learn how to refuse, the we's that are learning how to work within spaces, the we's. There's a way that I think that these multiple we's happen at once. But so there's that element of it. Particularly with dub, when the histories that writers like Isis or critics like Isis, Michael Buckner, like Janet Nye, I'm thinking of all of these critics of dub that are teaching us over and over. It's a we that grows. It is not a we that is fixed in place in that sense. And so I'm interested in that, and then a we that also leaves. Is this we? Like I'm thinking about recently, Isis did the work. Their new contribution to dub was to situate Scratch Lee Perry in the archives of dub poetry. And all of a sudden, that opens up certain possibilities in adding Scratch Lee Perry as one of those. And Janet Nye also just all of a sudden encouraged us to read Kai Miller, the poet Kai Miller, as a dub poet in that. So this we of the dub poets of the we that we return to, that I turn to, is now growing in that sense. And so I know you are wanting a question that is a political response, and I'm retreating to think about dub poetry because I am not confident to know what is to come, and I want to make room for, and I want to only speak about the things that I know and spend time thinking with, and what I've spent time thinking with is dub poetry, and yes, maybe that's the work of other people to make those pronouncements, but I do not feel like what I have to say on that is interesting nor profound or on that, and so I return to what I'm learning from this ever changing we and the minute Isis, for example, now adding Scratch Lee Perry to think about the poetry, all of a sudden opens up the poetry in complete different ways that now I'm being forced to kind of rethink what I thought I knew about the poetry because of the work that she's done. And so that's the kind of provisional we that I'm interested in, because that provisional allows me to rethink of what the totality of what I know. And so all of a sudden I'm constantly having to version what it is that I think I already know. And I enjoy that very much. Yeah.
I think it's both interesting and profound, and I think your presentation and your answers have been both interesting and profound in their content, but also in the form and in your courage to think through, think with this form, think with these artists as a way of thinking through our contemporary political moment too. So, thanks for both content and form. And with that, it's time for us to bring our time together to a close. Thank you for helping Transmediale close the first day of the symposium. For refusal, there's applause here in the audience, and also a huge number of very warm thanks that have been posted to Telegram. So thank you so much, and we'll take your words with us into the next day tomorrow.
Thank you, and as always, Mark, it's a pleasure to think with you. Bye, folks.